for all the speakers. This is a session. We don't need to go into the entire theory. Keep the innovation to 5 minutes so that we can have keep it very short so that it's very interesting for everybody, and then we can ask the audience question. And also, sir is here, so he can give us comment on how to take this innovation to the next level. I think he's the right person to guide us and help us on this. Dr. Sanjay, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rohit, and thank you, sir, for being here and giving me this opportunity. So I'm talking about a little different concept that when you have a PC rent, we were used to be to the idea that in case you have a PC rent with a residual nucleus, then the best way to go is you get the nucleus over the iris, put in an IOL scaffold. This prevents the nuclear pieces from falling back into the vitreous. You emulsify these nuclear pieces, and then this three-piece IOL, which was initially placed over the iris, is dialed into the sulcus. So this video is showing the same thing. The only issue which we thought was that there's a certain thickness to an IOL, and that reduces the anterior chamber depth, and therefore the nuclear pieces are too close to the endothelium, and you may have an effect on the endothelium, something like this. So we thought, why not look at some material which is thin, which can be placed on the iris, which is concave, which gives us more space between this scaffold and the endothelium. So in another situation, I first placed in an anterior chamber maintainer to make the chamber stable. You can see the vitreous is already highlighted with triamcinolone. We do a vitrectomy. And then the nuclear pieces have to be taken care of. So we used a new concept of what is called a bandage contact lens, which was altered to become a BCL scaffold. So a bandage contact lens is a size of 13.5 millimeters, and we cut it down to a size of 9 millimeters. Thin, can be injected through a butterfly cartridge, injected not under cover of viscoelastic, but just under BSS through an anterior chamber maintainer. We gently open it up, and it lies over the iris. Gently guide these nuclear pieces over the bandage contact lens. So you have a uniform scaffold. The ACM is maintaining the chamber very stable, so I'm not worried when I'm coming in and out of the eye that my chamber would collapse and the nuclear pieces would touch the endothelium. So once the BCL is in position, I can comfortably go in and emulsify these pieces. Because of the concavity upwards of this bandage contact lens, I have more anterior chamber space to do my phacoemulsification. So once the phacoemulsification is complete and it becomes a very routine affair, then suddenly there's another challenge. What about the epinucleus which is lying there? Well, in an IOL scaffold, I would have had to forego the epinucleus, but here under the BCL, I can maneuver this epinucleus again out and bring it over the BCL. And once it is up on the BCL again, these pieces can be emulsified.
Sir, if you can sum it.
Yeah. So I'll just go to the last part of it. This is how we make the BCL button. We are using a Trifine, a 90 Trifine, and you take this BCL out from the packing, place it on a corneal Trifine block, and make it to the desired size. This is the corneal block, a 9 mm trephine, and makes it to the required size. And once I've chopped it, the inner part is what I'm going to just show you. Just this is the BCL we used for this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Sangwan, sir, any comments on this?
It looks very interesting, but the challenge would be, doctor, is that the PC rent happens more often when you are beginning surgeon, and the senior surgeons don't have that much of a problem. So manipulating and putting and removing and then dealing with the vitreous, that might be another challenge that you have to solve.
That is always the challenge in a PC rent. Yes, that is
PC
unavoidable.
rent,
Yeah.
When you do manipulations and
True.
that affects your vitreous traction and other things, so that's something that we have to address.
True.
How big a rent you can manage with?
Any amount of rent, because the lens is resting on the iris. It has got nothing to do with the amount of rent behind.
Only thing you have to manage it behind the nucleus.
You have to bring the nucleus over these pieces.
Yes.
The only risk which some people have expressed concern is one, they feel that this is such a soft material that it can sink into the vitreous. Well, we have done 3 cases, and what we have done is now we have made a customized BCL which is a little thicker, and we have made a hole in the periphery through which we put a suture. So that in case it sinks, it has never done so in 4 or 5 cases which we have done, we can still pull it out. And the second concern which people have expressed is a BCL is not a device for intraocular use. So we have made these segments with a contact lens company, and they have sterilized it like they sterilize an IOL and give it to us in a bottle. So you can just take it and use it directly. You don't have to cut the piece now. So that would be commercially available in another 2-3 months.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'd like to call upon Dr. KPS Malik, sir. He's going to speak on Epifora of elderly with patent NLD. A new innovation.
How many minutes you have? You put in 6 minutes?
5 minutes, sir.
Maybe. How ठीक हो गया?
3 minutes of discussion. You please say.
मेरा तो पता है. I can run without.
Which podium you are running? Is this podium, sir?
I'd like to introduce my 2 other co-moderators, Dr. Shruti Kochar. She's from Indore. She's a cataract refractive surgeon. Dr. Vaitish, he finished his post-graduation from AIMS, fellowship with me. Now he's planning to resettle in Canada.
Good afternoon. To speak in front of 2 of the biggest researchers in this country, it looks little, you feel smaller than, because they are really in it and they really put time and money in it. And so, subdurging suture was meant, you know, there are conditions where you have nasolacrimal, but the duct is all right, you do syringing, it's a patent, and you still have a watering. So the Epifora, and that is commonly Centurion syndrome. Centurion syndrome you must have seen, I mean children, that you have the canthus abnormality. And first time I tried for this Centurion syndrome, young boys, and succeeded. So then I started using it in old people also. Principle is that you expose the lateral canthal ligament, put a suture 50 Prolene here, the curved needle, then I put it in the surgical needle, and surgical needle pass from lateral to medial. Then I cut vertically on top of the medial palpebral ligament and suture this in a way that punctum is turned in and punctum dips. In the Centurion syndrome, punctum doesn't dip in the lacrimose lake and it doesn't take the water. So that is what the principle of this surgery is. So Safdarjung suture name was given when we first time did it in Safdarjung. So this is what it is from lateral side. You put a surgical needle and it comes out medial side and we cut on the medial palpebral ligament. The needle, the curved one, is put in the surgical needle's eye and it comes with the suture, needle also comes out. And then you, same suture, you virtually have to tie same suture again, make a loop and tie it. And the tightening has to be done in such a way that the punctum turns in. And then I started using this suture for the elderly people who get lot of epiphora with the laxity of the lid. So then don't do the ectopion or pentagon surgery of that lid. Don't cut the lid hole. So this suture in many of them is successful, then it gives the cure of the epiphora. It is simply tightening, and then it tightens or makes the lacrimal pump also more functional, because orbicularis, once it becomes tightened, then it works more. And I have seen that if some granuloma came and the suture had to remove, once I remember, then even after suture removal, that whatever fibrosis has occurred there onto the muscle function has become strengthened or shortened or whatever you say, but it works still there. Mostly, if you cover it, because we put the sutures of skin over top of this, what the proline suture, so generally this granuloma, it doesn't come out, mostly not, unless you have not really buried the knot right into the muscle where you are doing it, in the medial peripheral ligament. So these are just to run the cases. So no time wasting in them. It is done in a lot of these young patients, old patients with the lower lid is lax, and this surgery does it very well, and you get. Thank you very much. This is all.
Any questions for sir?
Very interesting idea, sir.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting idea.
I'm taking water. Kiska I will leave.
Yes.
Thank you.
I would like to call upon Dr. Gaurav Kapoor is here. Then we'll call Dr. Mudit if Gaurav is not here. Dr. Mudit is going to speak on fibrin glue assisted vitrectomy for rheumatogenic RD.
All right, so good afternoon, and first of all, I would like to thank AIOS and the scientific committee for giving us the opportunity to present our work on use of fibrin glue in vitreoretinal surgery. I don't have any financial disclosures. Now, we all know that whenever we do a vitrectomy for our agmetogenous retinal detachment, we use a conventional tamponade agent, which might be either silicone oil or gas. But there are certain problems which are inherent with all of them. Post-operative positioning has to be given to all of our patients. There is always a problem of glaucoma or risk of corneal changes and cataract. Redetachments happen after oil removal. There is hypotony, repeat surgeries, restriction in air travel if you have put gas, and more importantly, a delayed visual recovery till the time either you remove the oil or till the time the gas bubble gets absorbed. So we thought, can we do something to circumvent the problems which these conventional agents bring for us? And if you look at it, a tamponade, the word comes from the word tampon, which means to plug. And tamponade agents essentially act by preventing a further fluid flow into the subretinal space till the time the effect of retinopexy, which is usually done with the help of laser, becomes permanent. And we also went ahead and checked an addition strength of nearly 95% is achieved at 18 hours after a laser photocoagulation. And usually maximum strength is reached around day 5. So you need a tamponade agent which can work till the time the effect of cryopexy or your laser becomes permanent. So we thought, can we use something else as an agent for that? And fibrin glue, which is a mixture of aprotenin, fibronectin, and plasminogen, kind of fits the bill perfectly for us. It has been used extensively in ocular surface procedures like SFILs, but it has also been used in intraocular surgeries like retinal or macular detachments and optic disc pits. It is an agent whose safety profile has already been studied way back in year 2000, and its safety in rabbit as well as human eyes and its effect on RPE has been studied. It's found to be safe. It has been used in optic disc pit associated detachments, like I said earlier, and also in full thickness macular holes. So essentially it's an agent which is safe for the use inside the eye. So this was a surgical technique which we did use. This is a schematic representation of the same technique, where after doing a vitrectomy, you do a fluid air exchange, settle the retina. Subsequent to that, you do a laser around the break to create a retinopexy. And after that, in an air-filled eye, you put a blob or a part of fibrin glue, 0.1 to 0.2 ml, which covers the break, thus tamponading the break. So for delivering it, what we did was we used a Med1 needle which can be attached to your vitrectomy sets with a VFC, and in a very controlled manner, 0.1 to 0.2 ml of glue can be safely applied over the break. And this is a surgical video which demonstrates the entire technique. So you do a complete vitrectomy. Here you can see an RD with an inferior break. And after doing a complete vitrectomy, which you have done over here, you do the normal steps, you mark it with a diathermy, do a fluid air exchange. Subsequently, after doing a fluid air exchange, you do a laser around your break. Essentially all the steps which you were even doing earlier for your vitrectomy. But after that, instead of putting oil or gas, you use a needle and you apply a 0.1 to 0.2 ml of fibrin glue over the break. So this is what we are doing. We apply the thicker component first and then the thin one to prevent any subretinal migration. And after waiting for 4 to 5 minutes, what you see is you see this plug of fibrin or this membrane which forms. And very easily you can just retract it back and bring it back with either a use of a forceps or with the use of your own flute needle, and you can just roll it back. The idea is to cover your break with this plug of fibrin glue. So what we are doing over here in an attached retina is we are just gently rolling it back, and after you roll it back, and all of this is done under air, you roll it back and you deposit it over at the end of the break. After doing that, you can safely go ahead and even remove the air. So this is what we did in this case. We removed the air, and subsequently after removing the air, we found that the retina was attached. So this is how the retina is at the end of the surgery, and this is a complete attached retina with a fibrin glue plug. So this is the first post-operative day photograph of the patient with an attached retina with a fibrin plug covering the break. And this is how the patient's glue plug evolved over a period of time. So this was a detached retina, 1 day post-op, and then at 2 weeks the plug gets absorbed. It's a protein which gets spontaneously resolved in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, the fibrin glue has gone away. The visual acuity is improved to 20/100 at the end of 2 weeks. And this is how the process evolves. So we have done till now around 31 eyes, and only 3 eyes had a marginally increased post-operative inflammation, which could be easily tackled by just giving 2 hourly Predford steroid drops. None of the eyes had any elevation of intraocular pressure at any of the visits. 7 eyes had a small subretinal migration of fibrin glue. But it's a protein, like I said, it gets absorbed. So this is what I am showing over here. So see, at day 1, there is a small migration of subretinal fibrin, but it goes away at 1 week, and at 2 weeks, you see again this entire glue has gone away. The retina is attached. You can see the laser marks, and the fibrin glue has totally gone away. So fibrin glue, we found, gets absorbed at the end of 2 weeks, and no post-operative positioning importantly is needed. So just one last slide. So the advantages are that it gives early visual recovery, avoids all the usual problems of a gas or oil tamponade, and you do not have to give a post-operative positioning to any of your patients, which can sometimes be a difficult thing to handle in some of our patients. I would like to acknowledge my mentors and colleagues, including Dr. Sangwan, who is here, who constantly used to push us to try to do something different, try to evolve a new technique, and thanks to his ideas and inputs by some of our other colleagues, we have been able to refine this technique further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mudit. Any questions? Anybody wants to play the devil's advocate here from the retina people? Anybody here? Yes, please. Your role is devil's advocate.
So, I'm not good at it, but I'll try. So, we know the PVR derives from fibrin degradation products.
True.
So, how doesn't it give an incentive for it to go that way?
It doesn't. So we have tried it in early, uncomplicated, simple RDs with 1 break, 2 breaks, or even breaks, 3 to 4 breaks, but within 2 to 3 clock hours. It does not work for larger breaks. Any break which is larger than 2 disc diameter, we see that the glue migrates subretinally. And in those cases, it does lead to a bit of a PVR changes, but not in early simple cases. And it lies over the break. So because it's lying over the break and it gets absorbed within 2 weeks, it does not lead to any significant PVR formation. We have now been having nearly a follow-up of 2 years for some of our patients. We tried this for the first time in somewhere around October 2017, and now we have got a follow-up of more than 2 years for at least 7 to 8 of our patients. None of them have got any PVR changes in the periphery at all.
I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Where is this protein? What protein is it? An animal-based protein?
It is. It's basically a mixture of aprotinin and thrombin. It's like
Okay.
blood.
It's basically thrombin and fibrinogen.
And
So
fibrinogen.
it's an animal-based.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a animal based.
So So you mentioned that 6 or 7 of your patients had high intraocular pressure.
No,
and
none
No,
of
no,
us,
inflammation.
none of them had any high
More of
intraocular
grip.
pressure. They had inflammation.
So can you, I'm sure you would have checked for it. Can you go back and check whether these patients were bronchial asthma or anything which had an high IgE?
Okay.
The reason is, it's very common, you see, if you really see the pattern, if you give a sodium hyaluronate based drops
Yeah.
to a patient with high IgE, he's not going to tolerate, because anything which is protein based, the body tends to create an excessive reaction to it. So if you go back and see, or in future, just do an IgE level for this patient, and you will probably find that patients who react differently will have a higher level of allergic component in them. Because
yeah.
it's even if it can happen to a sodium hyaluronate based drops,
true,
it
yeah.
should happen in your retina more vigorously.
True.
Yeah,
Interesting.
difference would be for the cornea, the constitutive expression of these markers and receptors probably much very high level as compared to your retina. Same for PVR. To develop, you need a gliotic or a fibrotic reaction, which is sort of constantly stimulated fibroblast. This glue being a very small protein, which gets eaten up by the cells in the vitreous or in the aqueous humor. Yes, doctor.
Can't you do something like self kind of a photo blood from the same person?
No, yeah, you can. There is a company, Johnson and Johnson has a Avisil, which is a human recombinant collagen and all human component in that. There is no allogenic component. Yes, that no genogenic component. No, safe. This is very safe.
Same person, I'm saying, can you do it from same person?
Yeah, same person. The process becomes a little more complicated in terms of preparing it and doing it as a procedure becomes much more complicated.
Do you think you could use it in, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You come closer to the mic, sir, if you just bend down a bit.
Just a thought, I mean, can you use it for the failed macular holes or the optic disc pits?
So this has already been used for optic disc pits. It's been used at least 4 years, 5 years back. There was a publication which came in OSLI also. We have also tried it in optic disc pit. It's known to work. People have also tried using it for failed macular holes, but the results of that have not been very successful. For failed macular holes, you need, the reason some of those are failing are because these are old holes. There is already a stiffening of retina. There are other factors which come into play for that. But it has been used in macular holes also.
You tried it.
I have not tried it for macular holes. I have tried it for optic disc pits. It's worked over there, but I have not tried it for a macular hole.
This you mainly do it for the inferior tears?
It works for both. In the last 20 of, I don't have the exact number, but in the last 20 of our patients, 15 were inferior retinal detachments. It works very well for inferior retinal detachments.
The inferior breaks, I mean.
Inferior breaks also. Yes, inferior detachments, inferior breaks, it works very well for them.
So do you have a positioning issue after that?
You do not have to give any positioning. That's the probably one of the biggest strengths of this surgical technique is that you don't have to resort to any post-operative positioning.
Thank you.
So for upper temporal breaks also it works, but we have not tried it for giant retinal tears. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Mudit, for your wonderful innovation. And I now call upon Dr. Bhaskaran Mani for his innovation in anterior segment imaging for glaucoma.
Thank you, Chairperson. My innovation is a simple goniophotographic instrument called Gonio Pen. So we do have this kind of gonio photographs with the slit lamp imaging that we have, and we need this expensive slit lamp imaging instrument. And all these ASOCT equipments are there, and currently we have this Nidec gonioscope as well. The cost is of course quite high, but this is the innovation that is Mini Pro for angle photography, and it will probably cost around $5,000 or something maximum, and $2,000 for the basic version. So with that, we can actually take a video graph of the gonio angle or take multiple images. And the main part of it is it actually comes with software also, which will automatically tell you whether it is open angle or closed angle. So the combination of these two will kind of make a difference in diagnosis of an open or closed angle in a general ophthalmology or a routine ophthalmology setting, and then you will only take those patients which have borderline closed angles to do your gonioscopy, and that's the simple innovation that we are trying to put up. And the new version will have a wireless imaging of the angle, and it will be like a simple pen-like instrument which you carry it around. So that's the innovation that we have. You can see that the automated solution will give you open or closed angle, and you can take a printout and keep it for your documentation. So it will be a very useful tool for an electronic medical record kind of a situation as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry? It is the highest version because we are also trying to look at it for a surgical thing, because for those minimally invasive glaucoma surgeries. But the basic version will be somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500. It has a particular high definition miniaturized lens. That's the main cost. If that can be manufactured in-house in India, or maybe in a very low cost setting, it can even come down to much less, almost a gonioscopic price. Thank you.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Any further questions? So, doctor, do you have to use any coupling or anything, or just?
Yes, it is. It is a contact device, but then it is at the limbal side.
Okay.
It's not at the center of the cornea, so the patient is much more comfortable, and it takes 30 seconds for all the quadrants, and that's a simpler
Okay.
method.
And now it's commercially available?
Not yet. The wireless version is getting tweaked, so probably sooner.
So
Thank
can
you.
this be used in pediatric glaucoma surgeries as well? Assisted goniotomies, assisted synoculitis?
That's the idea for the advanced version, but then that needs more regulations. So the regulatory hurdles are the issue for surgical gonioscopes. So we need to kind of tweak the materials that we use. So that will take some time to come about.
Thank you very much.
He'll speak on how to get sustainable international aid.
Thank you. This is not an innovation like what has been in the past. Just said, but just talking about a country program which I've been running for the past 20 years. Many development programs fail because nobody gives attention to manpower. There's no wow factor in training somebody. And the story that I'm going to talk about is East Timor, which is between Indonesia and Australia, which got its independence in the year 2000, and the whole country was destroyed. When I first went there on the invitation of WHO, these are the kind of things that you would see. But along with the healthcare system, the eye care system also collapsed. And for the first 4 years, we delivered what was called humanitarian care, looking at cataracts, looking at results of trauma and so on. But then the president of East Timor asked me, could I help set up the infrastructure? So that was all very fine. The idea was to work till we produced a complete package, test it, run it, hand it over. And I'm only going to talk about the manpower part of it. So we set up the central hospital in Delhi, which is the capital, and that's a view of the inside. But when you want to train an ophthalmologist, where do you start from? What comes first? You don't have a university, you don't have ophthalmologists who are there, you don't have a program that's running there for 365 days a year. How do you start? So in the University of Sydney, where I'm also involved, we set up a diploma in international ophthalmology, which was meant for situations like this, and the program's still running. So using various modules of training, of teaching that were online, we got through the theoretical part. Then Dr. Marcelino, who was the first ophthalmologist, came along to Australia to learn how to medically manage a disease. He then was trained surgically on site and was also trained in Nepal. He did a thesis on evaluation of vitamin A deficiency, and in the year 2008, got his Master of Medicine and became the first ophthalmologist. So you see, the input for training came from 5 countries for this young ophthalmologist. But what can one ophthalmologist do for 1.2 million people? Actually, not very much. We also needed to train the next cadre, and so we went on the Diploma of Ophthalmology program under the University of Timor-Leste, and we tailored a program to produce a good cataract surgeon, because I believe cataract surgery is the mother of all surgeries. And what we did was the same way you do here, but the first thing was we got somebody on the ground, so we had a program that ran for 365 days a year. All the 26 volunteers and teams that came used to come, during the year to provide service, then became teachers. They practiced their subspecialty. We had the same way we had an exam, we had a curriculum that we developed. People worked for 6 months, and then ultimately as an apprenticeship like everywhere else, these are registrars from East Timor, got their diploma in ophthalmology. They were trained surgically again in Nepal because I believe they got training in areas where there were large volumes and high quality surgery. We chose Lumbini Eye Hospital, and they were able to train them nicely in small incision cataract surgery. All these registrars have been clued on and have been encouraged to do audits, audit their own work and present it at international forums. So they're looking at quality control all the time. In addition, we also set up pediatric vitreoretinal glaucoma and corneal clinics so that the training and service delivery was complete. Corneal grafting was started in 2009. Michael Bellin from the States helped us with that. And we also got people trained in just specific procedures. Go for 8 weeks and just learn how to do one procedure, like a trab, or a core vitrectomy, or a buckling, so that one didn't have to wait for a whole fellowship to occur before we could provide the service. That's some snaps of the vitreoretinal service, and that's the list when we go there. So what did we learn, and how did this all work out? So these are the people now, these are the photographs of outreach when they go into different parts of the country. They look at and treat whatever they can, including pathology, which is often very advanced and late. So it's not only a cataract service, they look at everything else. Here are some more examples of totally Timorese teams now, where from the screener to the surgeon, they're all Timorese. And there are 13 outreach areas where they operate. We've also interfaced the College of Ophthalmologists in Australia and provided opportunities for our younger fellows to go and work over there, so that in the long term there will be relationships between the two countries working together. This scholarship has been opened up to globally, and we have a great intake also from Europe. But ophthalmologists don't work alone, and so we've had to train nurses, we've had to train optometrists, we've had to train low care services, we've got to train the whole workforce, so that ultimately when you train an ophthalmologist, you've got enough support, and also something that can be managed, packaged, and passed on to the government for the future. But lastly, when you train an ophthalmologist, are these people really ready to handle a country? Are they ready to run a department? Do they know how to read a balance sheet? Do they know anything about governance? Do they know how to handle politicians? The answer is sadly no. So the last module that they will be trained when they come back will be on these kind of things, so that when they are given the keys to the country, they would be able to manage the program rather than just be ophthalmologists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nitin. Very interesting points that you are making. Any question, comments before I make any comments?
Do they have the government?
Beg your pardon?
Do they have the government?
Yeah. It's a democratic republic with the president, prime minister, parliament, everything.
What happened? Why it got destroyed? What happened?
So in for 400 years, the Portuguese occupied. Then in 1976, the Indonesians invaded, and they were there for 25 years. And then there was a referendum which was sanctioned by President Habibie for these people to decide whether they wanted to be independent or not. And 98% of them voted yes. So when the Indonesians left, as revenge, they destroyed the whole country.
Okay. So in the training innovation, what I think is the surgical training in any field is very long.
Yes.
And so we need to have surgery-specific fellowship, which are shorter, which have component of technology, maybe simulators, and remote mentoring, using, say, Zoom or some sort of a video conferencing that you can do, so that these people,
Yes, I didn't have time to show that, but there is a telemedicine network now, and also we have diabetic screening with the AI-enabled cameras, again from here. So we've had to add that on. So I think doing a trabeculectomy is the least of the problem. When to do it and what to do afterwards is more important.
Yeah.
And that's where the links, the telemedicine, the communication partnerships become very important.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was very inspiring. I now welcome Dr. Pooja Khamar for innovations in imaging the collagen. Dr. Pooja has recently finished her PhD. Congratulations, Pooja.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Shruti, and thank you, AIOS and Chairman Scientific Committee for having me in this session. I'm going to be speaking about how important it is going to be in future about and what we have currently started working on imaging the collagen. At the outset, I have no financial disclosures when it comes to what I'm going to talk about. So we have a lot of topographic indices and newer indices are coming in. A lot of times normal looking two different topographies. One, for example, if you see a bad D will be normal, but the same looking topography, same pachymetry, the other side, the bad D will be abnormal. So what do we do? How do we solve this dilemma and which one to believe? Also, a lot of indices and a lot of scoring systems have come in, but still we come across post-refractive surgery ectasias. We operate on everything, making sure that everything is okay, and we come across ectasias. How do we go about it? What do we do? As I said, two topography, one normal topography, one suspicious topography. But the suspicious topography has normal indices and the normal topography has suspicious indices. What are we missing? Are we really in an era where we need to look beyond the topography or the biomechanics, as they are not sensitive enough to differentiate from the normal, from the form thrust keratoconus? What we decided was, we, along with the group in Vienna, we decided to build a custom-built polarization sensitive OCT. Now, why did we do this? We took a lead from Keith Meek's work, where he actually, this is a theoretical model on how the collagen bundles and the collagen fibers are placed in the cornea, and how the structure is in the right eye, the left eye, the superior, inferior, nasal, and the temporal. So we took a lead from his work and built it in that PSOCT. Now, what does PSOCT does? PSOCT does throws the polarized light onto your structure what you want to measure. For example, if you do want to measure the cornea, if you want to do a retinal imaging, if you want to do any other imaging, the sclera for glaucoma or anything else. You throw a polarized light. Now, what happens in cornea is, when you throw a polarized light, all the structures of the cornea takes this polarized light except the stroma. The stroma doesn't take the polarized light into consideration. So we are taking this advantage of the stroma, which doesn't take the polarized light into consideration, and studying how the collagen fibers are placed in the eye. So now this is the theoretical model which is placed, and this is how the representation of the PSOCT images when we measure a cornea, and this is the axis orientation map. These are the normal orientation map. If you see how in normal image the collagens are placed, and this is how it is on the axis orientation map, how the axis is going to be. So how does this PSOCT help us in our practice? I'm just going to focus on an anterior segment, as I'm a refractive and a cataract surgeon. Can it provide us an additive information in addition to topographers? Can it help in decision making for the type of surgery, which type of surgery we want to do? And also, can it help in looking at the keratoconus or the cross-linking outcomes? Coming to the first part, this is a patient. He has a posterior elevation. If you see the indices, the bad D, the CBI are suspicious, but the TBI, which is the addition of both CBI and bad D, it's normal. So what do? We did a PSOCT for this patient, and this is how it looks in the anterior stroma, the mid stroma, and the posterior stroma. This is how the normal looks like. But if you see the patient of this suspicious cornea who had a posterior elevation, if you see the posterior stroma, you see loss of collagens, which is not present in the normal eyes. So this is like a suspicious case, even though the indices are normal, you would not like to go ahead and do a surgery, or you would be cautious while doing a surgery. Coming to next part, can this PSOCT help in decision making of the type of surgery? Now 60% of the patients have normal topographies, normal indices. 20% are keratoconic, they are abnormal topography, so we are very safe with this 80% of the patients. But what to do when this 20% have suspicious topographies or suspicious indices? The challenge lies in this 20% cases. So what we did was, we took different type of topographies, suspicious looking or suspicious indices, 4 categories. One where the CBI, TBI, and bad D are normal. One where the CBI is normal, but the other two factors are suspicious. One where the CBI and TBI are suspicious, but the bad D is normal. And one where the CBI and TBI and bad D all are abnormal. Now, if you see the PSOCT image, this is how the collagen fibers look like in a normal one. The first category is absolutely normal. Second category also is normal, but you just see a small loss of collagen fibers here. Third where the CBI and the TBI is suspicious, yes, you see a small loss of collagen here, but the 4, there is absolute loss of collagen. This is how the normal looks like. So what we did was, for the first category, we went ahead and did LASIK and or SMILE. Second category, you can do a PRK. Third, we did SMILE extra. And fourth, where there was a loss of collagen, we deferred the surgery. So post-operative outcomes, what we found was that the first category where we have done a LASIK or a SMILE, they are absolutely similar, they are healing well. PRK, where you see there is a mild loss of collagen here, post-operatively also it is doing well. SMILE extra, where you see a small little loss of collagen here, post-operatively you see that it is maintaining the strength of the collagen and the collagen fibers structure on how it is placed. And this is the patient where we have not done any surgery. So if you see here, the PRK and the SMILE extra, both the arms are doing equally well. Now let's go to the case example which I showed you before, who had a suspicious looking topography, and on the posterior stroma she had a loss of collagens. So what we can do in this type of patients is we can, when there is a loss of collagen, we can, and posterior elevation, we can probably plan a PRK or a extra procedure. Should I go ahead? Okay. So basically PSOCT will help us in choosing the type of refractive surgery. It can help us in deciding whether to do an extra procedure or not. It can also help us in assessing the cataract incisions or remodeling, or assessing the unusual surgeon-induced astigmatism, the post-cross-linking outcomes, and in future it will help us in artificially cornea, how we construct it. Thank you.
Very, very interesting innovation. Especially getting that information is very, very critical, I think. It will...
We tell them to chop in the center, not go to the periphery. So they're not touching, going toward the CCC at all. It's actually safer. We have the safety data now, 2 years data, complication rates, we'll be publishing that later. That data is being collated right now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very nice.
Now, we obviously come across multiple maps of patients diagnosed with keratoconus, but obviously the question does arise, which of them will actually progress? When do we treat and when do we actually wait for these patients? How long do we wait for these patients? And actually whether will these patients actually progress? That's always been a question which has perplexed us. So now, I think there's something wrong with the presentation. As in, no, the images are not coming. I have my laptop. I'll just reload it again. I think I'll just reload my presentation back since there's some errors regarding the images. Yeah.
You want to present? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's not waste time. What's his name? Rohan Chauhan. Dr. Rohan Chauhan is going to speak on rising rays in retinitis pigmentosa.
Well, good evening, everyone.
Have you
uploaded your presentation?
Yes.
Zelda, you are ready? Yeah, come. Yeah, both of you. Let us. Oh, it's a combined thing. Okay, one of you can stand here, and they combinedly designed the software, and they. And what I've seen is only 30% of what is presented in this session actually becomes even a publication. So basically, the good ones we all clap and we encourage them. They don't even become a publication in the next 3 years. I am kind of following these things very well, sir.
I think few things that might help is, number one, many of us have a belief that it's my idea, so therefore I should not disclose, I should not give away, because I'll be at disadvantage. In those situations, try that it's an idea that you want to translate and request help from all over. We'll talk more points after the presentation.
You can finish off, sir.
The number 2 point is deal with yourself. Dealing with yourself is more important than dealing outside world. So what I mean that sometimes you get stuck. Oh, it's my name. If I am not acknowledged, don't worry about that. If you are trying to solve a problem, just focus on the problem and not your name. Third, just collaborate. Collaborate. You cannot do everything yourself.
Thank you. And introduce Dr. Vaitesh. Like I said, he is on his way to Canada. He's a cornea refractive trained surgeon. Dr. Zelda works in Bombay, Nair. At this point of time, she is working as a consultant at Nair Hospital. She's also trained in this. Both of them did some work on AI and trying to build this app. Now everything is coming into an app based, Swiggy, Apple, Uber, whatever. So I thought as ophthalmologists, probably in our own generation, I think 50 to 60% of your complex diagnosis will be app based. And our children, if they take up ophthalmology, I think everything will be app based. So they're going to show you something very interesting about how managing keratoconus can be an app based for the doctors, it's not for the patients. Dr. Zelda and Dr. Vaitesh.
Thank you for the introduction, sir. So we'll be presenting a novel app of keratoconus management. So the incidence of keratoconus has been on the rise in the last few years, definitely because of allergy and so many reasons, environmental reasons. But if you look at what everybody knows about keratoconus, most of them is keratoconus is synonymous with cross-linking. But though we have so many different treatment options, we also have so many different algorithms of management based on, say, the pachymetry, keratometry, the patient's other associated factors. But which one should we follow is a big question to all of us. And we have published this 5-point nomogram in 2015 in NIGEO, which combines both the demographic factors of the patient as, say, allergic factors or genetic factors and the patient's gender, age, and all the other factors combined with the patient's corneal details, which come into one nomogram. But again, this nomogram, we have validated this nomogram for its sensitivity and specificity and its accuracy, which is more than 90%. And still, if we find it's been out of access to a lot of them, and how they exactly utilize it to improve keratoconus care is still a question. So what we wanted to do was bring this keratoconus nomogram, management nomogram into an app and bring it to people's fingertips. And if you look at also the other scenarios, there are multiple patterns of keratoconus that you see, multiple patients with keratoconus. We do not know which patient is going to progress. And these questions are also, we try to answer based on artificial intelligence, which is incorporated in this app. So what we normally consider when we plan keratoconus management is based on looking at the patient's BAD-Ds, corneal thickness, and the keratometric maximum. So these are the factors that are looked at commonly by everybody. But could there be other factors which can help us in elaborating or improving the ability to detect which patient is going to progress faster? So that can be done with the help of artificial intelligence. So we'll first, what we did was, apart from the regular factors that we look into for progression detection, we took into all the other factors that our Pentacam gives us in the form of other topometric and keratoconus indices, and over 400 patients with over 4,000 follow-up visits were all incorporated based on whether they were stable or progressors, and the app did the machine learning to find out which factors, apart from these factors that are known to us, help in finding out whether this particular patient will progress or not. So what is the end result of the app is that we have combined both the nomogram, which includes the demographic and the keratoconus corneal factors, and the known factors that we know as people who manage keratoconus, and the artificial intelligence machine learning based newer indices which can tell when the patient will progress. So both of them were combined together in this novel app. We'll show you a few features of this app, and then we'll show you a case study of how it is done. So the KC Navigator app, as you go in, you will have to enter whether it's a new patient or it's a follow-up patient, and you'll have to fill in the demographic factors, and then take in a CSV file or a scan data from your keratoconus, from your Pentacam map, and connect it to the device where you have the app installed. And what it takes in the scan data, and from there it takes in the important indices that we already know. And after that, it asks for the other factors which you will have to fill in manually, as in the high-risk characteristics that the patient has got in terms of age, eye rubbing, genetic, IG, allergic changes or hormonal changes. So these things you will have to enter. And after that, it calculates its own demographic risk scoring. And then further, when you install, as you add on, whether it's the first visit or other visits, it will include the ABCD grading and the other gradings for which are already available, like the ABCD scoring and the DUX scoring. And based on all these factors together, it's going to suggest a high-risk score and a clinical score, and then it is going to give us the final management. So the algorithm for which it is based on is, if you look at the entire algorithm, first if you look at the right corner of it, a patient with a thinner pachymetry less than 400 and a central corneal scarring is going to obviously be used, obviously going to be taken up for a keratoplasty based on a partial scar or a full thickness scar. And if you look at this end, more than 450 and a cross-linking will be planned, and based on contact lens tolerance or intolerance, he will go into either a TPRK or the other modes of, say, if it's a decentered cone, it will go into an Intacs. And if it's a thinner cornea with no scarring, but you still want to go ahead with cross-linking, you can go ahead with the next UV calculator, wherein you will be able to feed in the exact fluence you will need to use for that particular level of corneal thickness. So we'll go to a case study. So for example, this is a new patient. You enter the name, you enter the age, you enter the gender of the patient, and then you enter the data from the pentacam. And after that, you will have to, once the scan data is taken, the high-risk characteristics have to be entered, in the form of the age, the eye rubbing, the serum IgE levels, the frequent change of glasses, and hormonal. So these are the high-risk characteristics this patient has. And after that, you further go on to, based on the high-risk scoring, it gives you the HRC score, and it classifies. And then clinically, you see the ABCD scoring is taken in for this patient automatically from the pentacam. It shows you all the features. You will have to enter whether scarring is there or not. And based on this, the stage is calculated. And HRC score and clinical score, once they are done, so based on the treatment, so the app goes back to the 5-point nomogram from which it derives the treatment. And in this particular case, it's a topo-guided PRK with the cross-linking. So based on this app, the clinical translation is one is that you can use the app which will have a component of both clinical demographic data and artificial intelligence based data. And the next step that we are doing is incorporating these newer indices which have been known to assess progression in a better way than the indices that we already know, and incorporate them in an existing software, existing pentacam, so that pentacam itself can give us these progressive indices in a better way. And the further part of the presentation will be taken over by Dr. Zelda.
Make it very quick about what you're trying to say so that we get the right gist. He has explained most of it already. Yes. Just about, you're taking one arm of Thin Cornea app which is already built, right? Yes. Just quickly go to that so that you can skip those slides so that we finish on time, another 20 minutes.
Can I have the slides, please?
You can just keep moving. Just go to that app. Everything else.
Okay.
Yes, just Thin Cornea, yes.
Yes. So when we're talking about the management of keratoconus, so we're very well versed with this, familiar with the simplified nomogram for the management of keratoconus. But what happens when the corneal thickness is less than 450 microns? How do we proceed? Well, can we proceed with the conventional C3R? No, because we know that the endothelial in human corneas, the cytotoxic endothelial UVA irradiance is reached at 400 microns. So, well, this is not an option. If you have a patient who has a cornea thinner than 400 microns, this isn't an option. There are different options available like transepithelial cross-linking, contact lens assistant, but they all have their own shortbacks and shortcomings. So why? Because the epithelium being on can itself absorb up to 10 times the oxygen, which is crucial to the process of photochemical reactions in the cross-linking process. There are also studies which have shown that the penetration of riboflavin reduces with the intact epithelium, which would bring us to our final option in such cases, which would be a corneal transplantation. However, if you have a young patient who has a good best corrected visual acuity of say around 612, this is not what you would proceed, and this is what brought us to our research question, is do we have any other options for cross-linking of thinner corneas? And that's when we stumble across this paper in which Hafezi et al. Described the principle of individualizing the fluence. That is, customized fluence is delivered to different corneal thicknesses by altering the irradiation time. That is, the UVA irradiation of 3 milliwatts per centimeter square is given for different times, and that means total fluence will be different. They also made an algorithm in this paper. It provides various algorithms which predict the biomechanical effect of the cross-linking by customizing the fluence to the corneal thickness. It takes various factors like UV intensity, the UV availability in the stroma during the treatment into account. And using these algorithms, we created what we call our NXT UVA calculator, which is a novel app for thin corneas in which the change in thickness changes the fluence time. As you see, at different epi of thicknesses, the app provides decides how much time should you provide the UVA irradiation for, be it 3 milliwatts per centimeter or 9 milliwatts, depending on what you use. So to validate this, we did a short study for 20 eyes of 20 patients with keratoconus. We included those with thinnest corneal thickness less than 400 microns and documented progression. Once the patient we underwent topography. The next step was to undergo epithelial mapping to determine the epithelial thickness, specular microscopy because we wanted to check the toxicity levels, and we feed these values into the app, and it tells us we undergo cross-linking. So with the help of an example, I will show you how the app really works. So as you see here, the patient has a thinnest local thickness of 390 microns. When we did an epithelial mapping,
Just don't go back. Play the video. You can contemplate. You can't. Yeah. Just don't touch this. Yeah. Let the video play. Yeah.
Yeah, we gauge the thinnest epithelial thickness according to the mapping that we have done. In this case, it would be 340 microns. So as you see, it's a simple app which can be handheld in your phone, and you will enter the thinnest micron epithelial thickness after the epithelium is removed. And as you see, it will tell you how much time to give the UV irradiation for. After the standard soakage for 20 minutes, we will give a customized fluence according to the NXT UVA protocol. In this case, it was 7.3 minutes.
Thank you, Zelda. I think basically we can sum up saying there was no major complications seen. Any questions for Dr. Zelda or this whole app? Sir?
I think it's very, again, very innovative idea in terms of for managing these things. There may be another angle that if you can develop an app for patient to choose a procedure or understand the procedure before, when they come. So instead of you spending a lot of time to explain, if they can, interact with the app and say what my options are by putting their own parameters.
Yeah, that definitely sounds very good. Thank you so much.
So I have a question. Is this only for Pentacam or even Cirrus data can be fed?
Any data can be fed, ma'am. You just need the thinnest.
No.
Only Pentacam.
Yeah,
No,
at this
in our
point of
study,
time,
it was what we used.
anything which can have a CSV files can be fed, right, Nikhil? Nikhil extensively worked. He presented in Apple Tree also on this. So how do you feed the data?
Yeah, that is why. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I now welcome.
Well, every time the innovations don't work, and sometimes you have to go back to the basics also. Basically, I'll be talking about the fantasies which has become reality at today's present day of time. No financial interest in the presentation. However, we do acknowledge the receiving of the grants from various national and international agencies. The diagnosis of retinitis pigmentosa is a lightning which has struck, and that has come to a dead end. But the rising hopes are now on. That has started with the Argus. We are not touching. That got FDA approval in 2012 and 13. But now, recently, the gene therapy has come up in a big way as a rising hope for the retinitis pigmentosa and various inherited retinal dystrophies. This is a vector which a Cas9 gene which is bound with an mRNA sequence which can fit to the designed article, and then they can get unlocked the DNA which is existing and the gene which has been trapped and targeted. The Cas9 is a molecular scissor which can cut the DNA into the pieces, and then when we inject a newly modified provided the proper sequencing gene that gets attached to the DNA double helix, and the other part also get attached, so that the gene is being replaced in the molecular basis, and then now the cell can be functional as a normal part. Luxturna is the first drug to be approved by the US FDA in 2018, which is only available in the US at this point of time, and only 6 centers are being allowed to carry on the treatment. The RPE65, which is an integral part of the visual pathway, but the diagnostic dilemmas will always remain, as there are symptoms which are not exclusive only to RPE65 gene, which can be diagnosed. So we need a definite gene typing to diagnose the thing. How do it work? How does it work? Basically, it's a gene delivery which is in the sub-RPE stage. You have to inject the drug in the sub-RPE stage. Then, thereby doing that, this RPE65 protein gets produced in the gene, and the protein functions and it restores the visual cycle. The AAV2 vector is the benign vector, and it's a virus which has a low potential to elicit an inflammatory response, and it's a non-pathogenic thing. This is a nice surgical video which can demonstrate how does it work. Basically, injection site is 2 mm from the fovea, and the total volume is 0.3 mm. The OCT guided, you first inject a BSS in the subretinal space to create a balloon. Now you inject a Luxturna in the balloon space. Just make sure that the viral vector does not spill over in the vitreous cavity. You create a balloon in the subretinal space, keeping in mind that the fovea is still not detached. Do a standard fluid gas exchange and finish the case off. This is another case from Dr. Tahira. This is the assistant which can hold. There are two vitreoretinal surgeons which are needed. First is the primary surgeon, another one would be the injector. The cannula injects in the subretinal space, and you can see a nice balloon pop up juxtafoveally. You have to make sure that the fovea does not get detached, and you inject the full volume of the dose. This is the other eye of the same patient, which is done 5 days apart to inject, and the nice pop-up of the subretinal ballooning with a viral vector and a DNA edited gene which has gone inside. Fine, this is the standard surgical procedure. You do a fluid gas exchange and finish the case off on table. But the thing is, how do you measure that? That's the basic thing, that how do you measure the functions? So they have developed a multi-luminance mobility testing that has a score based from 0 to 6, depending on the lux, which is 400 lux to 1 lux. This corresponds to the brilliantly lit office of 400 lux to the moonless summer light of the 1 lux illumination. This is the standard mobility test 1 year post-treatment. On the left, you can see the hesitant movements of the patient, and on the right, you can see a fairly nice, confident steps, and he is able to follow the steps and the arrows which are made on the floor, and he is able to finish the test in quick time, whereas on the left, the patient is struggling to find the way out. So Luxturna has 65% of the participants, 13 out of 20 in the intervention group, were successfully completed the MLMT at the lowest light level of 1 lux. Just finish in half a minute. 89% of the participants, this was very hopeful, that 89% of the participants, they passed at 1 lux after 1 year even. So the improvement which is mentioned is not a short-lived, but it's a long-lived thing. At present, they have sustained 4 years of data, and which is quite promising. They have got an US FDA approval. They are still planning for 15-year post-randomization follow-ups. See, everything looks fantasy, right? Other than this, the cost in Indian rupees for a single dose of injection is coming to 6 crore 20 lakh rupees. So it's 8,50,000 US dollar per injection per eye. So that's an exuberant thing at this point of time for any of the patients. They have made, after 2018 where it launched, they've injected 65, they've sold 65 vials, and presently they are still managing and counting the things. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? I was just discussing with Sir now, when we were looking at our data pool of patients with RP who can be, even if somebody says that they have 6 crores to pay, the RP65 mutation in our country is very, very rare.
Yes. Yes.
So
there are racial differences which are
even
there.
Even in US, RP retinitis pigmentosa due to RP65 gene mutation, single gene mutation, are very uncommon.
Exactly. There are multiple genes which contribute to that, and there are simultaneous presence of multiple genes. So to find a single genotype defective patient is still difficult for the US patients also. They have made only 32 patients for the FDA approval.
So it will be a challenge.
Yeah, but still there is something to
Yeah,
have.
that's how it's. I mean, we started off with penicillin.
Exactly,
And today we have multiple things. So penicillin was a novelty. So exactly, I'm sure that this is how he's going to change. And I think institutions like SIRS and us, we're all looking at our own data pool and trying to see if we can use that data pool as the area where we can work around a gene therapy for them. So
Yes.
basically, that's how it should work.
We are also planning to collaborate with the 6 institutes at this point of time, but still in the initial phases of us also.
Thank you.
But
Thank you.
at this point of time, you would be glad to know this is the most expensive ever drug sold in US market.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Gairik is the last speaker of the session, and he's going to speak on AI-based. So I think some of it part has already been covered. You can skip them and just go only where how you build the AI for the interest of people, so that we don't have any repetition of slides.
And
Okay.
also maybe you should make a comment about AI for everyone's to bring up.
To understand, I'll do that.
Just go to that part, and they can skip everything else because it's not.
Finally, the AI was able to rectify my PowerPoint. We'll now move into a little bit of how we built the artificial intelligence. Now, we normally look at multiple parameters. Now, what happens is, as clinicians, we focus on what is most obvious. Now, when we look at progressors or we look at multiple topography maps, there are hundreds of indices. Some are asymmetry indices, some are progression indices, even BAD-D. Now, which one do we look at? We are always biased at looking at things which are most obvious, and that's where the role of artificial intelligence can come into the play. Now, there are multiple published work which look at selected number of indices, but do not look at multiple indices in general. So, what is artificial intelligence? Now, it works on a simple algorithm, right? The first aspect of artificial intelligence, to simplify it, which has not been covered by my earlier speakers, is the fact of machine learning. Now, what is machine learning is, we given multiple inputs or variables. In this case, these are the indices or the topographic indices which are commonly seen in our maps. What AI does is puts it all together, uses that base to tell itself and learn itself what is normal, what is abnormal, or whether it's able to classify it as whether it's a stable or a progressor. Now, there are various ways of building an artificial intelligence algorithm. The most common and what we normally do is something known as a random forest classifier. So what is a random forest classifier? It's a decision tree. Now, this basically randomly picks up multiple variables. It can be keratometric, it can be pachymetric, it can be based on aberrations, and it gives it a discriminant value or a node. Now, if you look at, it's something like a, multiple distributions, multiple nodal points. Now, based on the normative or the value which we feed in, it gives a cutoff value and goes into the next variable only if that cutoff value is overcome. To simplify it, a random forest looks at multiple factors at one given point of time and its relationship between each other. Now, based on this algorithm, the AI is able to learn or become intelligent enough. The next time when we actually give it variables, it's then able to put those indices in those specific nodes, and it tells, yes, this is greater than this value. Okay, I think this patient is a stable patient or is a progressor patient. So that's how AI works. Now, there are other ways of artificial intelligence as well. One, something looked at, something known as a support vector machines, something known as neural networks. Okay, so there are multiple ways of generating an AI, but the most common what we use is something known as a random forest classifier. So we wanted to ask ourselves whether we can use these data from these indices from the maps, and can we predict progression in keratoconus using artificial intelligence? So we looked at multiple patients. We went retrospectively, looked at 430 patients of keratoconus. It included over 2,500 scans and multiple time points. We fed this into the AI algorithm. Now, any AI data has two sets. One is a training data set, like I said, is a machine learning. That includes basically telling the machine or explaining to the machine that this patient is a stable, this patient is a progressor. The next aspect is something known as a testing data set, where we validate our machine learning. So we give random data or patient data regarding the indices to the AI, and then try to figure out whether the AI is actually able to utilize that learning to predict whether it's a stable or a progressor. So surprisingly, what we actually did and we could crack was the fact that almost 83% of the times when the patient was actually progressor, it was accurately picked up by the artificial intelligence algorithm in our case. Now, there were multiple indices, some things which we normally do see. But what is important is AI is able to pick up multiple indices in combination. Now, it can be keratometric, some can be with relationship to aberrations, but how it helps us is it looks at multiple indices simultaneously. By doing that, that's something which humans normally do not look at, it's able to increase our accuracy in predicting progression or not. Now, there are multiple theories as to why AI is actually picking up these indices. Some subtle changes in the anterior curvature of the cornea, which were what are picked up by the indices by the algorithm we created, is what is picked up by the AI earlier than what is actually picked up by indices which we normally look at. Surprisingly, when we put up data with relationship to multiple scoring systems which have already been published, or whether we look at BAD-D, it was not able to pick up. So what happens is these normal indices, the change has to be quite significant enough for it to be picked up by an artificial intelligence. But subtle changes in combination of those multiple indices which I listed, if it is picked up by an artificial intelligence earlier, that can actually improve the accuracy of clinicians in predicting progression or not. So this is in fact the first attempt by us in looking at integrating anterior segment maps with artificial intelligence. And we are actually building this into something known as a probability indices for classifying keratoconus with artificial intelligence for progressors. So these AI-based indices can actually be integrated into existing topographers, and that can in fact help in increasing accuracy of progression. But there is obviously some limitations. That's very important for us to know. AI is cumbersome. Now, data mining is the most important aspect of artificial intelligence. Edge detection and the quality of scans, something which we as clinicians don't look at, is in fact very important. So there was a patient who in fact did progress, but when we looked back into the scans, it in fact had a issue with the edge detection. Now, many a times, the softwares in the pentacams are not able to detect the scans with fair bit of accuracy, and there are gaps. If you look at the image to your right, there's in fact a gap in the image quality which was not being detected by the software. So this can actually throw up as a pseudo progressor and can throw AI way off way. So the main aspect is selecting the correct data, sorting it out, and then giving it to the AI so that it's able to increase our outcomes. So AI can be a new way of looking at it. We still are at a stage where we are maybe at 500 patients. Obviously, the number of patients we analyze needs to be increased, but I think this is the way forward. AI is in everything we do. At Google search engines, where they look at Flipkart, Amazon. We have done obviously AI with posterior segment diabetic retinopathy as well, but this is in fact our first attempt at looking at anterior segment imaging. Thank you.
Thank you, Gairik. Any questions? Basically, what he's trying to say is that if the patient comes to you for the first time, if you have a running AI, the AI is going to tell you, based on the scans and the way the scans have shown over the last 4-5 years, whether this probability of this patient's progressing. And 83 or 86% of the time it was right in showing. And the second point is the so-called hyped parameters of some machines. I would say hyped because sometimes a lot of indices of some machines have been hyped for no reason, without any proper validation. And those hyped so-called algorithms or so-called values, unfortunately, did not test the real test of AI. AI did not even look into that like a BAD-D or one of them, which is quite surprising. And it picked up values from Pentacam. There are more than 3,000 or 4,000 small data points out there which we have no idea. I mean, maybe less or more. It picked up 5 of them in combination, which probably I've not heard any clinicians also would go back and look at those values. So that is the real power of AI in picking up things which probably human mind has not really looked into it, because we look more at the obvious and machine looks at a combination. That is why it always looks in a combination of many things. Thank you, Gairik, and I thank Dr. Sangwan sir, Dr. Shruti and Dr. Vaitish and all the speakers and all the delegates who supported us till 5:25. We finish on time. Yeah. Sir, anything?
Yeah, just a comment about especially this AI-based device. I think it's a very good technology. If you can also incorporate that collagen imaging we were talking about, and then start doing your imaging of normal patients who are undergoing LASIK, and they don't have any problem at all. And then you have this data over a period of time, and when they come back, some patients will come with the, thinning or localized ectasias. In those situations, your machine will learn much predictably, yes. Second, if you can make this program available to different researchers, who can feed their data. Because for AI, the more the data is, the better the program will be. So if you can open it up, develop a system where people can plug in their data, and then they can get some output out of it specific to their, and your database gets built up.
We'll be doing that in the second aspect where we validate the results. So our initial aim is now with respect to machine learning. Once we actually build it up to a state where we can distribute it, then a validation is when
Multi-center. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
All the speakers, if